They auctioned her holding her baby, but a Lakota warrior lifted his hand before anyone else. They pushed her through the heat-warped gate so roughly that the baby almost slipped from her arms, and Mary tightened her grip fast enough to make her own wrist ache as the sheriff barked for the auctioneer to get this over with, because the crowd was already restless, and the sun was burning down on the town square like some cruel overseer judging her worth. The baby whimpered against her collarbone, small fingers clawing at the fabric as if sensing the fear spilling off her skin, and Mary tried to shush him, even though her own breath was shaking too hard to steady his. Because the moment the wooden platform came into view, she knew the sheriff hadn't been bluffing when he said her debt would be settled publicly, since a woman with no husband, no land, and a hungry child was community property once she fell behind on payments. And the men gathering in front of the stage looked exactly like the kind of men who enjoyed owning what couldn't fight back. The auctioneer slapped his ledger against his thigh, calling for silence, and the crowd responded with jeers, mutters, and the kind of laughter that cut deeper than any bruise Mary had collected over the past desperate years. Yet she stood there anyway, barefoot on the cracked wood, clutching her baby so tightly that her arms trembled as the auctioneer announced her starting price as if she were nothing more than a mule with a mouth to feed. A rancher shouted $2, another laughed that the brat ain't worth feeding, sell her separate, and someone in the back spat about her being too skinny to last winter, while Mary shrank her body around her child, bending as if she could curl into a shell thick enough to block out the voices, the hunger, the stares, and the sickening realization that no one here saw a mother. They saw a burden with a heartbeat. She whispered to her baby, "I'm right here. I won't let go." Even though she knew the sheriff could tear him from her arms the moment someone decided they only wanted her, not the infant she'd nearly died delivering in a freezing shed 2 winters ago. The baby cried louder as the auctioneer raised his voice to drown out the noise. But before another bid could rise, before another man could decide her future, the air shifted as the crowd's attention snapped toward the open end of the street, where a tall Lakota warrior stepped into the square, with a silence so heavy it made the jeering stutter and fall apart like dust against stone. He moved with calm, unhurried steps, his braids dark with travel, his expression unreadable, his presence so commanding that the men who moments ago shouted prices now lowered their eyes as if instinctively aware that something had changed. And Mary felt her heart jolt not from fear, but from something colder, sharper, hope she didn't trust. The warrior stopped at the edge of the platform, looked at Mary, then at the baby, and without saying a single word, he lifted his hand, palm facing the auctioneer, in a gesture that froze every voice, every breath, every cruel intention in the square, as if the entire town had collided with a wall it didn't understand. And Mary, holding her trembling child, felt the first moment of stillness she'd been given in years. For a moment, the entire square hung suspended in a silence so unnatural that even the horses tied near the trough lifted their heads as if sensing a shift in the air, and Mary held her baby tighter, half convinced she was imagining the Lakota warrior's raised hand, until the auctioneer, flustered and red-faced, sputtered a laugh loud enough to hide his sudden unease as he barked, "You! This ain't your business, warrior. Go on back where you came from." But the words rang hollow because not a single man in the crowd echoed him. The sheriff took a step forward, hand resting on his gun belt in the stiff, theatrical way he used whenever he wanted to intimidate someone quickly. But the warrior didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even look at the sheriff. He kept his gaze fixed on Mary and the baby, as though anchoring himself to something the crowd couldn't see. And Mary felt the strange steadiness of his attention settle over her like an unexpected blanket against cold wind. When the auctioneer tried to restart the bidding, the crowd didn't respond. They looked at the warrior instead, waiting for what he'd do next. And the auctioneer, rattled by the sudden shift in authority, jabbed his finger toward Mary, as if reminding everyone she was town property under debt law. "He doesn't get to interrupt," the sheriff said, louder now, but the edge in his voice betrayed that he wasn't entirely sure of that. And Mary felt a tremor of fear crawl through her because men like him never backed down without turning vicious. The warrior slowly lowered his hand, stepped one pace closer, and reached into the small leather pouch tied at his belt. Not quickly, not threateningly, but with the calm precision of someone who didn't fear the 50 angry men surrounding him. And Mary's breath caught, because no one, not even the bravest drifters who passed through town, ever challenged the sheriff openly. The warrior drew out a strip of folded hide, opened it, and revealed 3 silver trade tokens and a small carved piece of antler polished smooth by years of touch, placing them deliberately on the stage at Mary's bare feet, making the whole crowd murmur, because even those who knew nothing of Lakota customs understood this wasn't a bid. It was a statement. The sheriff spat. "That ain't legal currency." But his voice wavered because the warrior didn't argue. He simply looked at him, a quiet stare so steady it felt like a verdict. Mary, shaking, whispered, Why help me?" Though she doubted he heard her over the baby's soft whimper, yet something in the warrior's expression shifted. Just barely, the faintest tightening around the eyes, like someone recognizing a wound they'd carried once themselves. The auctioneer, now desperate to regain control, lifted his gavel high as though he could smash the moment apart. But the crowd didn't move. Nobody shouted a higher bid. Nobody mocked the warrior. Nobody demanded Mary be sold. Instead, the town waited, breath held, unsure which man would break first. The sheriff with his false authority, or the warrior with his unshakable silence. And Mary realized with a jolt of terrified hope that for the first time since this nightmare began, the power in the square had shifted away from the men who wanted to own her and toward the one man who stood between her and a fate she no longer had the strength to imagine. The auctioneer's arm hovered in the air as if the gavel had suddenly turned to stone in his grip, and Mary felt the baby's breath hitch against her collarbone, while the Lakota warrior remained as still as a carved pillar, his presence bending the noise of the square into a strange, brittle quiet, where even the wind seemed afraid to move. No one shouted, no one argued, and even the rancher who'd first bid $2 lowered his gaze like a boy caught stealing. The sheriff shifted his stance, boots scraping on the packed dirt, trying to muster the authority he'd used to drag Mary here in the first place. Yet when he opened his mouth to speak, whatever words he planned were swallowed by the sheer weight of the warrior's silence, a silence so firm it felt like a boundary drawn without a single gesture. Mary didn't dare speak, not even to soothe her baby, whose small whimpers softened, as if he too sensed the tension had turned from the crowd toward the tall figure standing only a few feet away. And then, in a slow and deliberate movement, the warrior positioned himself fully between her and the sheriff, his body acting as a shield, not touching her, not claiming her, simply standing in the space where cruelty had lived moments before. The sheriff bristled at the gesture, jaw tightening, but the warrior's calm cut through his bluster like winter wind slipping through a cracked door, and the townsfolk who once jeered now whispered anxiously, unsure whether they were witnessing a challenge, a misunderstanding, or something older than the laws written on the sheriff's badge. The baby made a soft, almost curious coo, reaching one tiny hand toward the warrior, and the crowd inhaled as if this simple gesture carried more meaning than the entire auction. The warrior didn't reach back, didn't step closer, didn't break the vow of non-intrusion etched into every measured breath he took. But his gaze flickered to the infant with a softness so subtle it could have been imagined. And yet Mary felt it ripple through her like a warmth she hadn't felt in years. The auctioneer finally lowered his gavel, clearing his throat in a feeble attempt to regain control. But the moment had shifted irreversibly, because the warrior, not through force or violence but through absolute stillness, had rewritten the space around Mary into some place where the sheriff's threats no longer held their usual shape. When the warrior slowly turned his head toward the crowd, meeting the eyes of every man who had thought to buy her, each gaze dropped in turn, as though confronted by their own reflection, and no one dared raise a hand or voice. Mary exhaled shakily, realizing she was witnessing something she couldn't name. A silent verdict passed without a single word spoken, while the warrior stepped aside just enough to look at her directly for the first time, the quiet in his eyes telling her more than any promise could. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in this moment, not in this square that had nearly swallowed her whole. The sheriff finally barked for everyone to clear the square, but his voice had none of its usual swagger, and the people moved not because he commanded it, only because the Lakota warrior stepped back from the platform, as if giving Mary room to come down. A small but undeniable shift in who truly held authority now, and Mary, clutching her baby, felt her knees wobble with a mixture of fear and something unfamiliar that might have been relief. She tried to descend the steps quickly, though her legs trembled so badly the wood blurred beneath her. And when she nearly slipped, the warrior extended a steady hand, not touching her, only offering balance if she chose to take it. But Mary jerked back instinctively, the trauma of men claiming her so deeply carved into her bones that even kindness startled her. The warrior didn't show offense, didn't move closer, simply lowered his hand and waited in a way that made the sheriff curse under his breath because no power play worked against someone who refused to engage in the rules of ownership. And Mary forced her feet down the last steps, adjusting her baby who had begun to whimper again, as if sensing her heartbeat fluttering hard against his ear. The townspeople parted like water around the warrior as he walked beside her. Not leading, not directing, only ensuring the sheriff couldn't reach her. And Mary, still unsure whether this man was safety or another unpredictable threat, found herself quickening her pace toward the wagon sheds at the edge of town, even though she had nowhere to go, no home to return to, and no idea what happened after an auction was stopped by a man the town feared too much to challenge. When she stumbled over a loose board near the trough, the baby let out a sharp cry, and Mary froze with panic because she knew the sheriff watched for any moment of weakness he could exploit. The warrior, however, stepped between them again, just enough to block the sheriff's line of sight, and Mary realized with a painful jolt that he wasn't trying to claim her. He was trying to give her space she hadn't been offered in years. A sudden gust of wind lifted dust into her eyes, forcing her to wince, and she instinctively shielded her baby while backing toward the old freight shed, where the sagging roof cast just enough shade to gather her breath, though her pulse still pounded with the fear that the sheriff would drag her out again. The warrior remained at a distance that was both protective and respectful, his posture relaxed, but prepared, watching not her but the surroundings as if expecting danger from every direction. And Mary, gripping the baby with shaking arms, whispered, "I don't know why you helped me." Though she didn't think he'd answer, not with words anyway. The warrior turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with an expression that held no ownership, no demand, only a quiet certainty that unsettled her more than cruelty ever had, because it suggested he didn't need a reason Mary understood to stand between her and the world that kept trying to break her. And in that small, shaded corner of the freight shed, she felt, for the first time since everything collapsed, the faint, fragile shape of safety forming around her like a breath she thought she'd never draw again. Mary had barely found the courage to lean against the freight shed's crooked wall when the baby's soft fussing shifted into a sharp, choking cough that punched fear straight into her ribs. The kind of sound every mother recognizes instantly as danger, and she pulled him upright in her arms, patting his back with trembling hands, while panic scraped at her throat because he'd been hungry, exhausted, and exposed to dust for too long. The coughing turned harsher, his tiny body jerking with each attempt to draw breath, and Mary's heart shattered as she whispered, "Please, baby, please," tapping at his back with increasing desperation. But the infant only wheezed, face reddening in terrifying spurts that made the world around her blur. She staggered away from the shed, crying out for water, for help, for anything. But the sheriff stood across the square with his arms crossed, expression cold with the satisfaction of a man who believed suffering proved a point, and the townsfolk lingered at a distance, unsure whether approaching her risked becoming part of a conflict they feared more than compassion. The Lakota warrior, however, moved before anyone else even understood what was happening. He crossed the distance between them in 3 deliberate strides, stopping close enough for Mary to feel the steadiness radiating from him. But he didn't touch her or the baby. He simply knelt slightly, lowering himself to the infant's level, palms open, waiting for her to choose whether to trust him. And Mary, torn between terror and instinct, hesitated only long enough for another fit of choking to force her decision. She held out the baby with shaking arms, her breath a jagged whisper, "Please help him." And the warrior accepted the child with the same gentleness one uses to lift something sacred, bracing the infant upright against his forearm with remarkable care, while using 2 fingers to sweep the baby's mouth lightly, checking for dust or blockage without causing fear. The baby coughed again, sharp, rattling, desperate, and the warrior shifted him forward, supporting his chest and back with practiced precision, giving soft, rhythmic taps that were neither panicked nor forceful, each motion controlled as if guided by memory rather than instinct. And Mary froze in stunned disbelief, because this wasn't the clumsy handling of a man who'd never held a child. This was someone who understood infant fragility and knew the difference between fear and distress. The baby sputtered once, twice, then released a wet, wrenching cry that filled the entire freight yard, a cry so full of relief it drew Mary's knees weak beneath her, and she covered her mouth with both hands as tears blurred the warrior's outline into shimmering shapes she couldn't hold steady. The warrior didn't gloat, didn't look at the sheriff or the crowd. He simply waited until the baby's breathing steadied into small, hiccuping breaths before returning him to Mary with the same caution he'd used to take him, ensuring her arms were secure before letting go. And Mary pressed her cheek to her son's damp forehead, sobbing with the overwhelming mixture of gratitude and disbelief that swept through her like a storm she had no shelter from. The warrior stepped back again, resuming the respectful distance he'd maintained since the square. But this time, Mary saw something new in the way he held himself. Not indifference, not obligation, but a quiet, unwavering dedication that made her realize he hadn't saved the baby to prove anything to the sheriff or the town. He'd done it because he refused to stand by while another innocent soul fought for breath in a world that too often stole it away. Night fell hard and fast, the kind of deep prairie darkness that swallows the edges of everything. And Mary, still shaken from the baby's choking spell, followed the warrior only because remaining near the freight shed meant staying in sight of the sheriff, whose expression had turned meaner with every hour. The warrior didn't speak, didn't motion with his hands, didn't lead. He simply walked ahead at a slow, steady pace that allowed her to choose the distance, pausing every few steps to ensure she could keep up while holding the baby tight against her chest. When they reached the abandoned blacksmith porch at the far end of town, one of the few places not directly visible from the saloon windows, he stopped beside the old barrel stove, crouched, and began stacking wood with deliberate calm, each piece placed carefully to avoid sudden noise that might startle her or the baby. Mary watched with wary eyes, unsure what he intended, but when he struck a spark and coaxed the flame into a small, controlled glow, she realized he was offering warmth without asking her to accept anything else. The fire cast a soft, amber light across the warrior's features, revealing dust smudges on his cheekbones, tired shadows beneath his eyes, and a steadiness in his posture that made the night feel less monstrous. And Mary, clutching the now sleeping infant, slid down onto the porch floorboards with her back to the wall, letting the heat reach her aching fingers. The warrior remained outside the circle of firelight, close enough to react if danger came, far enough that she never felt cornered. And for several minutes they sat in a profound, protective silence, broken only by the crackle of kindling and the faint whistle of wind slipping between the shutter hinges. Mary caught herself studying him, trying to understand the contradiction of a man so feared by the town, yet so intentional in offering comfort without intrusion. And when the baby stirred with a soft whine, the warrior glanced over, not alarmed, not concerned, just quietly observant, as if every sound the child made was a signal he was prepared to interpret. She whispered, "He's just dreaming," though she didn't know why she bothered to explain, and he simply nodded once, the firelight revealing the faintest curve of empathy across his otherwise unreadable expression. A sudden howl of wind rattled the old iron tools still hanging near the porch, and Mary flinched at the metallic clatter before she could stop herself. The warrior shifted instantly, stepping forward just enough to block the open side of the porch with his body, not facing her but turning outward toward the darkness, as if absorbing the threat into himself. The gesture, the quiet, instinctive protection with no demand attached, hit Mary so sharply she had to look away, overwhelmed by the foreignness of safety delivered without price. The baby's breath puffed softly against her collar, rhythmic and trusting, and she adjusted her shawl around him, letting herself breathe a little deeper as the fire warmed her numb feet. The warrior remained there, motionless, until the wind eased and the porch settled back into stillness, and only then did he return to his seated position, maintaining the respectful distance that had become his silent promise. Mary didn't speak again, didn't thank him, didn't dare step closer, but as the firelight flickered between them and the baby slept in her arms, she understood, with a surprising ache, that this man's silence was not emptiness. It was a vow spoken without words, a vow that said she and her child would not face the night alone. Dawn hadn't even touched the horizon when the heavy stomp of boots shattered the fragile quiet around the abandoned blacksmith porch, and Mary jolted awake with her baby still tucked beneath her shawl, her heartbeat slamming into her ribs as the sheriff's voice cut through the cold morning like a whip. "Step away from the woman, warrior. She's coming with me." The warrior rose before Mary could even sit upright, his movement calm but absolute, positioning himself not in front of her this time, but at a slight angle, far enough to avoid cornering her, close enough that no one could reach her without meeting him first. And the sheriff, flanked by 3 ranch hands emboldened by the early hour, sneered as if convinced the night had weakened the resolve that halted the auction. Mary clutched her baby tighter, sinking back against the wall, praying the infant wouldn't wake and cry, because any sound might provoke the men who came armed with entitlement rather than justice. The sheriff tapped the butt of his revolver like a signal, growling about unfinished debt law and accusing the warrior of interference, insisting Mary had no right to refuse being taken since she'd been marked for sale in front of witnesses. The warrior remained still, shoulders squared, eyes steady, not reaching for a weapon, not even shifting his weight, simply watching the sheriff with a patience that made the ranch hands fidget, as though they suddenly doubted the plan whispered over whiskey the night before. The sheriff lifted his chin toward Mary, snarling, "Bring her out!" But when one ranch hand stepped forward, the warrior's hand rose just slightly. Not a threat, not a strike, just a silent command that froze the man mid-step, as if an invisible line had been drawn across the ground. The ranch hand swallowed hard, retreating a pace, and Mary felt the baby stir with a soft hiccup, her stomach twisting as she tried to rock him gently without drawing attention. The sheriff, frustrated by the lack of obedience, snapped, "She belongs to this town, not to you." And those words hit Mary like a slap, the reminder of how small her life had become in the eyes of men who measured her worth in chores and debt, rather than breath and humanity. The warrior finally moved, not forward, but sideways, placing his body fully between Mary and the sheriff, his posture saying what he still refused to voice aloud. "She belongs to no one." The sheriff drew his shoulders back, spitting dust from his lip, signaling his men again, but none stepped forward this time. The memory of the auction, the warrior's unbroken silence, and the child's desperate choking still hung in the air like an omen none of them wanted to tempt. "We'll take her by force if we must," the sheriff hissed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed doubt. And the warrior responded by planting one foot more firmly into the dirt, grounding himself in a way that told everyone watching he was prepared to withstand the entire town if needed. Mary's breath caught in her throat, because she realized this moment, this standoff under the weak blue of morning, was no longer about debt or law or fear. It was about dignity, hers and her baby's, and the fact that a man who owed her nothing was willing to risk everything to prevent her from being dragged back into the cruelty she'd escaped by accident, rather than mercy. The sheriff cursed, stepping back in frustration, and Mary felt a tremor of hope she hadn't dared touch in years, as the men hesitated, uncertain whether the price of claiming her was worth challenging the quiet, unyielding force now standing between them and the life they believed they could own. The sheriff wasn't used to retreating, and the humiliation of being defied in front of his own men curdled into a rage that sent him storming toward the center of town, shouting for every shopkeeper, ranch hand, and loafing drifter to gather as witnesses to a lawbreaker. But Mary knew the truth. He needed a crowd to mask his cowardice, because cruelty always felt safer when performed for an audience. She followed at a distance, clutching her baby close, her legs trembling as the warrior walked beside her with steady, unhurried strides, never touching, never directing, only ensuring no one came too near. By the time they reached the main street, a cluster of townsfolk had already formed, pulled from their early chores by the sheriff's bellowing, and the street filled with murmurs as the sheriff pointed at Mary and accused her of fleeing debt, colluding with a hostile, and endangering the peace. Charges so absurd that even a few of the lazier men exchanged puzzled glances. The warrior stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a presence that made the crowd instinctively widen around him, and Mary felt the weight of 100 eyes slide over her. Some pitying, some judgmental, most simply afraid of standing on the wrong side of the sheriff, yet none of them willing to speak, because silence had always been the town's truest law. The sheriff, emboldened by the growing audience, yanked his revolver halfway from its holster in a theatrical gesture, snarling that no foreign warrior tells this town what to do. But the moment the gunmetal glinted in the morning light, the warrior moved. Not fast, not violently, but with a directness that froze the entire street. He stepped between Mary and the sheriff, one arm angled subtly back to shield her without touching her, his posture grounded like a rooted tree bracing against a storm. The crowd fell silent as the sheriff, face flushed with anger and humiliation, fully drew the gun, trembling with the need to regain the control he'd lost since the auction. But a thin cry from Mary's baby pierced the stillness, a small, frightened sound that ricocheted off the storefronts and hung in the air with a weight far heavier than the sheriff's threats. Something shifted then, not with the warrior or Mary, but with the crowd itself. A storekeeper stepped forward first, muttering, "Sheriff, it's a baby." As if the words alone broke some unspoken rule, and others followed, murmuring uneasily, glancing between the sheriff's drawn gun and the infant trembling in Mary's arms. The sheriff barked at them to stay back, but his voice cracked under the pressure of a town realizing its own reflection in the cruelty unfolding before it. The warrior didn't raise his hands, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't speak. He simply turned his head slightly, meeting the eyes of the men closest to the sheriff, and something in his gaze, calm, unwavering, unimpressed by their bravado, made even the boldest among them step backward. The sheriff, sensing the shift, cursed loudly, accusing the crowd of cowardice, but the words bounced back at him with no force because fear had begun to evaporate, replaced by the uncomfortable truth that Mary had never been the criminal here. When a rancher muttered, "Let the woman go," and another added, "Sheriff, this isn't right," the sheriff's authority cracked like old wood, and Mary felt the moment the street stopped belonging to him, not because the warrior had claimed it, but because the town finally recognized the line between justice and the ugly convenience of oppression. The sheriff's gun wavered, and as the crowd's voice rose, not loud, not violent, just firm enough to drown his, Mary realized that in this single, breathless moment, the street wasn't turning against her. It was turning against him. The sheriff's gun trembled in his grip as the murmurs swelled into a steady, unified murmur of dissent, and Mary, clutching her baby so tightly her arms ached, felt the shift ripple through the street like a tide she'd never dared imagine. Men who had mocked her on the auction block now avoiding her eyes as if ashamed of the roles they'd played. Women whispering to one another with uneasy guilt. And even the ranch hands who once smirked at her desperation looking down at their boots as though something heavy had settled across their shoulders. The warrior remained motionless, centered between Mary and the sheriff, his calm presence holding the crowd in a fragile but powerful balance. And when the sheriff shouted for everyone to back down or face charges, his voice cracked, not with authority, but with fear. The fear of a man witnessing his power crumble in front of the very people he'd relied on to uphold it. One of the shopkeepers, an older man with trembling hands, stepped forward and said, "Sheriff, selling a woman for dead ain't the law, never was." And his words carried farther than he expected, stirring memories of what the town used to claim it stood for, before hunger and drought had twisted its moral spine. Another voice rose, a woman's this time, saying, "She worked our laundry for 2 winters. Never missed a day." Then another, "I saw her ask for help at the store. She wasn't running from debt. She was trying to feed that baby." The sheriff barked at them to shut up, but no one obeyed, and Mary's breath caught as the truth she'd never been allowed to speak finally spilled into the open, piece by piece, through the mouths of others instead of her own. Her legs trembled, overwhelmed not only by fear, but by the shock of being defended for the first time in years, and the baby stirred, sensing the tension loosening around them. The warrior didn't move, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a softening at the jaw that almost resembled relief as the crowd began to step away from the sheriff and toward something more human. When the sheriff raised the gun again out of desperation, 4 men at once stepped between him and the rest of the town, not to defend him, but to block him from harming Mary, their expressions grim with the realization that allowing his cruelty to continue meant implicating themselves in it. "Put it down," one of them said, not loud but firm, and the sheriff, red-faced and breathless, looked around at the faces he'd always assumed belonged to cowards, and saw instead people who'd finally decided not to follow him into his own darkness. The warrior took 1 step forward, not threatening, just final, and the sheriff's hand faltered, the gun drooping before slipping from his fingers and landing in the dirt with a dull, pathetic thud. A hush fell over the street as he backed away, sputtering excuses no one cared to hear, and Mary felt a tear slide down her cheek as the crowd parted to let him pass, not out of respect but to get as far from him as possible. The warrior turned toward her then, not claiming credit, not accepting gratitude, simply bowing his head slightly as if acknowledging that the victory wasn't his. It was hers, and her baby's, won by the truth finally spoken aloud. And as the crowd stepped aside for them, creating a clear path down the street, Mary understood that for the first time since the town tried to sell her, she was seen not as property or burden, but as a woman who deserved to walk freely with her child in her arms. The street emptied slowly, like a storm losing its violence drop by drop, leaving behind only scattered dust tracks and the echo of 100 shifting consciences. And Mary stood with her baby pressed against her heartbeat, unable to move at first. Because freedom felt so foreign, it made her limbs tremble with disbelief. She waited for someone, anyone, to shout that it wasn't over, that the sheriff would return, that the crowd would change its mind as quickly as it had turned against him. But no voice rose. No hand reached to take what had nearly been sold, and the quiet that settled over the town wasn't the cold silence she'd lived under for years. It was the stillness that follows after truth finally finds daylight. The warrior didn't speak, didn't ask her to go with him, didn't claim any right to guide her next step. He simply stood close enough for her to feel protected, but far enough that she could choose any direction she wanted, without interference. Mary breathed in the fragile peace between them, then glanced around at the empty storefronts and the dusty path stretching toward the hills, aware that she had no home left in this town and no place waiting in another, only the aching determination to keep her baby safe and the faint hope that maybe safety didn't have to come from a roof. It could come from distance, from air, from the absence of cruelty. She shifted the baby in her arms, adjusting his blanket, and for the first time since the auction, his little body relaxed fully against her, as if even he sensed the danger had passed. When she looked up, the warrior's gaze softened, not asking a question but offering one in the quiet way he always did, and Mary hesitated only a moment before nodding toward the open road that led north, where the prairie widened into safer country. The warrior nodded once in return, agreement without ownership, and began walking beside her at a gentle pace, matching her speed without leading, ensuring she had every choice and he had none to impose. The path wound past the last fence posts of town, where the sun began breaking across the horizon in thin bands of gold, painting the world in a warmth Mary hadn't felt in years. And as she stepped into that light with the warrior at her side, she realized she no longer feared the road ahead. Not because she knew where it led, but because she no longer walked alone through the danger behind her. A soft breeze lifted a strand of her hair, brushing it across the baby's cheek, and he made a small, contented sound that tightened something inside her chest. Something like hope, fragile, but real. She didn't know if the warrior would stay with them beyond this morning, or if their paths would eventually part once she and her baby reached a place safe enough to call their own. But she understood one truth clearly. Whatever came next, it wouldn't begin with fear. As the town behind them shrank into a distant shape, Mary glanced one last time over her shoulder, not in longing but in closure, then turned back to the quiet stretch of prairie waiting ahead. The warrior adjusted the leather strap on his shoulder, preparing for the long walk, and Mary felt gratitude settle deeply into her bones. Not dramatic, not spoken, just steady, as dawn unfolded around them like a second chance she'd never expected to see. And with her baby sleeping peacefully at her heart, she stepped forward into the day with the simple, powerful certainty that they had survived something meant to destroy them, and were free now to build whatever life mercy would allow. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a mother and her twins sleeping on a bench, would you have stopped like the cowboy did, or walked on? Tell us in the comments.